Hi guys, welcome to Unit 3.4. In this unit, you have finished your rough draft. You're moving along toward your final draft. You're probably deep in the throes of your research and hopefully getting ready to revise that rough draft and move it toward your final draft option. So we talked about this a little bit in Unit 2, where we were discussing the analysis. But now it's more imperative than ever to ensure that when you bring information in from outside sources, that you present it very properly and very carefully. Whereas in the analysis paper, you were sort of just able to choose quotes, bring quotes in, cite them, and then continue talking. Now we need to really focus on the structure of how to bring in information from your sources and bring it in with its context as well as its context in the overall in your paper, okay, as it relates to your thesis statement. So in the previous conventions video, we said that there were various types of information that are going to appear in your paper. So you're going to have your words, which are, of course, your words. You have common knowledge, you have quotes, you have summary, and you have paraphrase. So our last video, we talked a little bit about what summary and paraphrase are and how to do them. I also mentioned, again, very briefly, that in summary and paraphrase, in a research-based paper, only about 25 to 33% of the paper can be cited. That means that only about this much can be information borrowed from outside sources. The rest of it has to come from you. Now we're like, hey, now this is a research paper. I'm not an expert in this subject, and that's right, you're not. So how on earth are we supposed to make sure that at least 2/3 of the paper come from you? Well, in Unit 2, we discussed the concept of analysis. The concept of analysis is where you pick out particular concepts, particular ideas that appear in multiple sources, and you explore the connections between those concepts, their value, their implications, what they mean, why they matter, how they work, etc., in order to help us better understand this particular issue you were exploring. The same thing happens in a research paper. So, anytime you bring in outside information, right? Anytime you bring in any of these, and we'll talk about common knowledge later because I often get questions about this. That's for the next convention video, okay? So for now, anytime you bring in any of this information right here, you have to cite it. You have to also tell your reader what it means, why it matters, what its implications are, how does it support the thesis statement, what is the purpose of this information in your paper, why is it here, how does it help you. Remember that your reader hasn't read any of the research you have. They don't have the thought processes that take place in your head. They don't understand the connections that you see between your sources, between the ideas that these various authors are presenting. You have to actually walk us through that process, thought by thought, sentence by sentence. And that's where the other 2/3 to 3/4 of the information comes from, is you making those connections for us so that we can understand how these concepts interrelate. So we do this by what we like to call a quote sandwich. Some people call it the Oreo. Anytime I say that, then I always want Oreos, and I try to bring them to my classes. Here's looking at you, kids. So, whoops, excuse me. So the first thing that we need to do is introduce the quote. So a lot of times, let's say we're writing about masks, right? And so we're talking about something like viral particles in the ambient environment, right? Viral particles out here in the air. And then we present a piece of information from one of our authors that says, therefore the mask can't touch your lips. And we're like, see, we shouldn't, we can't have a mask touching our face when there's particles in the ambient environment. And we expect our reader to just know why. Your job is to explain why. And so first you have to get us from particles in the ambient environment to the quote about it not touching the lips. And then you have to explain why that matters. Okay, so maybe you remember, I made some changes to this paraphrase, you guys, because it was absolutely terrible. Maybe you remember our paraphrase from the last video. Okay, we have this Lustig paraphrase. Lustig cautions there must be no air gaps around the edges of a cloth mask, and masks must never touch the wearer's mouth area in order to prevent that individual from ingesting viral particles. Okay, that's a little better. It's still not great. We'll get there. Okay, I need to introduce this quote. I need to help us understand how did we get to talking about air gaps, and how did we get to keeping a mask from touching the wearer's mouth. Okay, the next thing that we need to do is to deliver the information. This is the information I'm going to deliver. Okay, this is the center of my sandwich. It's what gives it substance. Okay, and then I need to discuss that information. This is where I analyze the information. This is where I make connections between concepts and explore their importance to the overall discussion. And, very importantly, to the argument claim in the thesis statement. So how do we do this? Okay. Here we go. Here is our paraphrase. Now, in this case, the idea here is that when you have a cloth mask, like this, it's made of cloth, and many of these masks actually absorb water, okay? They are hydrophilic. They like water. So what happens is somebody else is out here breathing in the general environment, and there are gaps around the edge of my mask because I'm not perfect, okay? So I've got air holes here, and air can come out of here, and it's got little pieces of moisture, right? Little pieces of humidity. They're known as aerosols. And those can hold viral particles. So they're out here in the ambient air. Well, what happens is somebody else walks by, and those little particles get stuck on their mask. Okay? Now they keep breathing inside of their mask, and they have these particles on the outside of the mask, and after a while that mask can become damp. When the water soaks into the mask, the particles come with it. Now there's also water coming from the mask wearer, right? There's humidity inside the mask, and so it pulls the particle from the outside to the inside, and this is what this particular individual calls wicking transport. It can be wicked from one side to the other. Now I explained this earlier in the paper, but that was from the inside out. The particles can come from the inside, move to the outside if we're in a damp environment. Let's say we go out in the rain and then we go inside, and it can actually pull our spit, if you will, and our particles from the inside to the outside. So now we're talking about from the outside in. So we're going to introduce the quote. Wicking transport can also occur from the outside in, even if an individual properly follows all masking guidance, which means that it fits really well. Viral particles from another individual can soak into the outside layer and be carried to the inside because of moisture. Okay, so then we have, therefore, I changed the paraphrase just a little bit again. Okay, therefore, these guys caution that a mask must not be able to come in contact with the wearer's lips, tongue, and saliva. So this is my introduce. This is my deliver. Notice now that it's shorter than my introduction. Okay? And then this is my discuss. This is the why. So keeping it from coming into contact keeps that person from ingesting those particles. Why does that matter? Because if it sits there on your face, then that wearer, you, can take in even more particles than you might if you're just breathing in the general air, because you've been walking around and they settle on your mask and they soak in, and so now they're just right up there with your face. So even if the mask was up off your face and you took a deep breath, you're going to get fewer particles that way than if it sits on your face. Why does that matter? Because the more particles you inhale, you have a higher chance of contracting the virus, and it can become more severe. Okay? So this is just my author. This is connections I'm making from learning the other concepts from the other articles that I have read. Okay? The same thing with our other article. Oh, here, let me scoot this down to make it a little bit easier. This was our paraphrase. So Aydin, these guys point out that we have to make sure that the wearer can breathe and make sure that particles have trouble coming through the fabric. So how do we introduce this? Well, people have difficulty complying with masking guidelines because they can't breathe. So we have to find a balance between the two. If we have a fabric that has too many threads in it, right, like 600 thread count cotton is harder to breathe through than say 120 thread count cotton. Okay. If you're having trouble breathing through something and you try to take a deep breath, not only is it hard to get air in, but it also causes the mask to suck towards your face, touch your face, maybe sit on it, maybe it's touching your face regularly. So then we run into the challenge that Lustig is talking about. Okay. But if we get a mask that we can breathe through, then it's also pretty likely that moisture and droplets from your environment can pass through the mask. So we have to make some compromises. We have to find a way for us to be able to breathe while we catch most of the viral particles. Okay, again, introduce, deliver the information, discuss the information. Once again, our borrowed information is the least part, okay? The rest of the paragraph is us making connections between the pieces that we've learned and we've introduced elsewhere in the paper. Now, early on in the paper, you might have a little bit more cited information because you have to introduce these concepts, right? You still have to introduce, deliver, and discuss them, but the further you go into the paper, the more you can make connections between ideas that you've already introduced and concepts that you've already introduced. You don't have to cite them again. They've already been presented in the paper. We already know where they came from, so now we can just understand the connections between the pieces. This is where that analytical piece happens, and this is where you're really making the case for your argument. Because the reader understands better why and how this piece of information supports the perspective that you're explaining in your research paper. So make sure that anytime you bring information into your paper, you use that introduce, deliver, discuss method. You should never have a paragraph that ends on a citation. And if you do, you should not have more than one in the paper, and it should be such dynamite information that really nothing else could follow it. Okay? I hope that your processes are going really well. I hope that these videos are useful to you, and I hope that you are learning some interesting things, even if you're not necessarily having fun in writing your research paper.